Hey everybody, welcome to the very first episode of Beyond the Highlighter's 5-minute mark. This is going to be an ongoing 5-minute video series where we're going to take one biblical passage and we're going to break it down exegetically. So you're going to see exactly what you should be marking, key words, key phrases, things to underline, things that help us make sense of the passage, what it's really saying. So for an example of this and a demonstration, follow along with me today, grab your Bible marking utensils, and let's see what it really means to go beyond the highlighter. So the first set of videos will come from the Gospel of John. We're going to be looking at the chapters that contain what I call chapter-specific keywords. Now, every book of the Bible has important words to find all throughout, but sometimes there's a word that is extremely theologically significant that only occurs in a chapter or two, and John does this quite a bit. So today's symbol of interest in John 2, 1 through 11 is wine. Now understand that according to John chapter 20 verses 30 and 31, John's purpose statement, that his goal is to show the world that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, to produce belief in his readers so that they may have life in his name. And John accomplishes this goal in a number of levels, and one of his methods is to record thematic passages where Jesus figuratively likened himself to physical things, or something was compared to him by others that reveal who he truly is, which is the Son of God. So the first chapter that does this is chapter 2, and this chapter is kind of a 2-for-1 since wine is a key word in verses 1 through 11, and temple and house are key words in verses 12 to 25. So let's start with wine in the first 11 verses. If you'd like, pause the video at this time and take a moment to read the passage. Now notice the purpose. The reason why John included the account of Jesus turning water into wine in the first place. Look at verse 11. See that it was a sign that Jesus performed to manifest his glory, which produced belief in his disciples. Now remember back to John's purpose statement in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. By including this account of Jesus performing this sign, John is already accomplishing his goal so that you too may believe that Jesus is the Son of God and have life in his name. Next, notice the key statement the head waiter makes in verse 10. He says, "Every man serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then he serves the poorer wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." What the waiter doesn't realize is that his statement contains an ultimate truth about who Jesus is. Jesus is the good wine that has been saved until now. Well, what does that mean? Well, look back at chapter 1, verse 17 with me for a minute. Now there, John says, "For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ." Now with this verse and others like it in the book, John is making the point that everything that came before Christ, like Moses, the law, the prophets, Elijah, kings and queens, they were not the final realization of God's plan of salvation for mankind. The law served its purpose, but it didn't contain the fullness of grace and truth. Moses was an integral figure, but he's not as good as Jesus. God saved the best for last by sending Christ to earth at just the right time in history. Jesus is the good wine. So this sign is for Jesus' disciples and the others at this wedding to see his glory, to understand through a simple comparison of good and poor wine that Jesus is like that wine and that he was saved for last. The best has come. Now, if you're curious what this passage looks like marked up in the Gospel of John Bible Keywording Guide, here's a glimpse of what this passage looks like when it is completely keyworded. Aside from the word wine, these words and phrases are seen throughout the Gospel and should be marked. Now, if you want to dissect this passage even more, here are a few things that I would suggest that you look for and mark with your own symbols. So first up, make sure you always mark the point, and that is that Jesus in this passage is the good wine in verse 10, and that is that he is the fulfillment of God's plan for mankind. Next up would be the people. Now, if you're using a Bible keywording guide, be careful with this one since both Jesus and disciples have their own designated symbol. I personally don't mark all references to people all the time, and especially not with the same symbol, but in this passage here you have the mother of Jesus, you have Jesus himself, the disciples, you have the bride and groom, and they're called they, referenced as they. Then you have the servants and the head waiter, and of course you have other guests that are there as well. They're just called the people. Then there's places. So in this case, there's a wedding in Cana of Galilee. Now be careful with this one and other passages as well, because some places can be as specific as somebody's house, so always be mindful of that. And then finally, the periods of time that help set the stage and place this account in the narrative. So in this case, you have the third day, which by the way tells us that John has likely already made note of a first and second day. You may want to go back and look for those. And then you have the phrase, "My hour has not yet come," and that happens to be a recurring phrase throughout the gospel, and you can find references to those in the Bible keywording guide. And then you have the beginning of his signs in Cana of Galilee. Thanks for tuning in to the pilot episode of the 5-minute mark. I hope you got a lot out of it, and I hope to see you next time to continue going beyond the highlighter.